Today on Cityline, how to overcome fear through science and how a mayor's quest to meet celebrities is giving his hometown some press. Hello everyone, I'm Karen Holmes Ward. Welcome to Cityline. Later in the program, we're going to meet a mom driven to write a book about difficulty selecting her child's preschool. And we'll talk to one of the country's youngest mayors who decided that meeting celebrities and writing about it would give his hometown a boost. But first, how does one overcome fear? Life Unlocked, 7 revolutionary lessons to overcome fear, delves into the complex science behind fear, including subliminal fear, saying that science holds the key to letting go of fear that is self-limiting and a true roadblock to happiness. The book is written by Dr. Srinivasan Pillai, Assistant Clinical Professor of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. Welcome, Dr. Pillai. How are you?
Very good, thanks. Thanks so much for having me.
So, Srini, tell us how people develop fear in the first place. Where does it come from? And why do people let fear hold them back?
Well, you know, the contributions to fear are really multifactorial. They are part biological, part psychological, and part social. So to a certain extent, genes do confer a certain kind of vulnerability to becoming anxious and becoming fearful. And our chemistry also represents a lot of what fear and anxiety is about.
So some of fear is you're born with it? It's inherent in your DNA makeup?
That's correct.
Oh.
Except that one of the things we're discovering more and more is that this does not necessarily mean that you can't overcome it. Mm-hmm. For example, genes play a major role in anxiety and fear when you're much younger. But as you get older, it's the psychological and social factors that actually play a much greater role.
Often you see young kids jumping into a swim pool or doing daredevil stuff, jumping off garages when they're young, right, because they don't have fear.
Right. Absolutely, because at that point their brains are not trained to pick up threat. I think part of learning as you're growing up is sort of learning what to avoid that may or may not be dangerous. So to a certain extent, there's a trade-off though, because fear is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it protects you. On the other hand, it also keeps you from some of your greatest goals and ambitions in life.
What are some of the physical characteristics of fear? How do we know? I mean, everybody has sometimes dryness in the mouth, or the hair stands up on the back of your neck or something. What are some of the physical traits that are associated with fear?
Well, there are two kinds of fear, and part of the reason I was inspired to write this book was that a large part of fear, probably the most impactful parts of fear, are actually unconscious. So when there's conscious fear, you may have symptoms like shortness of breath, palpitations, sweating, trembling, unsteadiness, feeling a little dissociated. Sometimes nausea can also be a sign of fear. You can also have tingling. And you can have sort of all sorts of thoughts as well, like fear of dying or fear of going crazy. I mean, people report these kinds of symptoms. However, fear can actually impact you completely outside of your awareness. So you can be walking around, your heart rate will be normal, your breath will be fine, you won't have any nausea, any sort of instability of any kind, but fear will still impact your brain and can actually impact your thinking and decision making as well.
Is that subliminal fear?
That's correct. So it's subliminal or unconscious fear, and I think because most of the time we're paying attention to what conscious things occur, we imagine that subliminal or unconscious fear is not that important. The reality is that it's probably even more impactful. Just to give you a sense of that, a recent study was done on relationships. And a lot of times people say that in relationships will last or not last based on what's happening consciously. How much hostility, whether you're compatible, that kind of thing. The study showed that the conscious variables, like what you notice consciously, don't really impact whether you're going to stay together or not. It's really the stuff that's completely outside of your immediate awareness that impacts what's going to happen to the relationship.
Now, what's the best way to cope with any kind of fear, particularly if the situation is out of your control?
Well, a couple of different things. You know, this particular book is really about self-help. So, within the self-help context, you know, we can sort of talk about the approach that I talked about in the book. I would say if fear is really excessive and if it's taking hold of your life, you might want to also see a professional and sort of think about the possibility of using medications and about doing a professional kind of therapy.
Particularly if it's crippling.
That's right. If it's crippling, because I think even if you're going to use the self-help, sometimes having medication or seeing a professional for therapy can just take the edge off.
An example is of someone who might take a sleeping pill because they're afraid of flying, for instance.
Right, exactly. So you can use medications to help you when it comes to sort of help from other people. But when it comes to self-help, the general approach that I've outlined in this book in every chapter, whether it's fear of success, you know, whether it's fear of your greatest ambitions in life, fear in relationships, recovering from trauma, the general approach is what I call the map change approach, which is meditation, interventions related to attention, and then psychological insights related to that particular fear. Because for each fear, there are subtle differences in terms of what you're going to be thinking about. So the reason I wrote the book was, you know, I felt like a lot of people were talking about self-help and how to overcome fear, and we were understanding a lot from a psychological perspective and from a spiritual perspective. But there wasn't a whole lot out there.
And you've identified 7 steps, in fact. What are the 7 steps?
Well, no, it's really more about sort of 7 different kinds of fear. So each chapter is about a different kind of fear. So the first chapter is about unconscious fear. The second chapter is about a fear of success. The third chapter is about sort of unlocking a caged heart. You know, what happens when you're afraid in relationships. Then there's a chapter on conditioning and how fear causes certain habits to occur in the brain and how we can overcome that. There's also a chapter on prejudice, and I'm trying to understand how prejudice impacts what's going on. And then there's a chapter on trauma as well. So I cover a wide range of fears on a number of different issues.
How are fear of success and fear of failure connected?
Well, I think for a lot of people, fear of failure is sort of obvious. You know, you're afraid to try something because you know that if it doesn't work out, you're going to feel badly. So fear of failure is a little bit more obvious. Fear of success is really the underbelly of the fear fear of success is the underbelly of the fear of failure. So a lot of times, people will say, I don't really want to do that. It's something that I really don't want to do. But what people don't recognize is that the brain is actually an excuse-making machine. It'll actually make up excuses for stuff that you're afraid to do or stuff that you can't do. So a lot of people who fear success, you know, initially say, come on, you know, get real with me. Why would I ever fear success? I want to be successful. And what I would say is that in my work with people and looking at some of the brain imaging research, what we find is that a lot of people are afraid to reach their greatest goals in life because when they reach their greatest goals in life, they feel that people are going to expect them to maintain that. And then the public eye is going to be on them. Their lives are going to come under scrutiny. So there's a lot of unconscious fear around this kind of idea. Also, when you're successful and at the top, you're literally at the top, which means there's nobody ahead of you to guide you. There's nobody else around you. It's a pretty lonely feeling. And so a lot of people will tend to reflect on this or process this unconsciously and then say to themselves, oh, I don't really want that goal. You know, and just to give you an example of this, you know, when people have a right-sided stroke in the brain, and in a region called the parietal lobe, they have a left-sided paralysis. And so they can't move the left side of the body. And if you ask those people to move the left side of the body, they actually are in denial of that at a physical level. They don't know that they can't move the left side of the body. But the brain makes up excuses. So if you say to them, can you please move your left leg? What they'll say is, I don't feel like it. And so when the brain says, I don't feel like it, really what it's doing in some instances is making up an excuse for something you can't do.
Okay. All right, Dr. Pillay, it's a very interesting book, and I must point out, you obviously have no fear of being fashion forward. I must say, I love the boots.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
I appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thanks
when we come back, important news about how to choose the best preschool for your child.